So I'm Trevor Stephenson, Artistic Director of the Madison Bach Musicians, and Kathy called me a month or so ago and said, would you like to talk about the St. Matthew Passion? Because Madison Bach Musicians is doing the St. Matthew Passion here in 2 performances coming up in a couple of weeks. In fact, it's 2 weeks from tonight that is the opening night over at the Hamel Center. As Kathy was indicating before, this piece is, it's kind of like every time I open the book on it, it's like seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time. It is a work of unfathomable complexity. Bach, we know that Bach cherished it because he had his own perfectly handwritten copy that he kept editing and razor blading pages out of and sewing in a revised portion of the. This is the guy who had 5 jobs and 20 kids and all of that, right? He had no time for this, and the piece was never published, but he took that much care with it. He really believed in it, and we're glad he believed in it because it's kind of, up at the King Lear and Hamlet levels of complexity, and it actually works. A little bit about when Bach wrote it, and then we'll talk about the structure of it, because I've got a half hour to really get us in and back out, and it'll probably only be for the first half. So remember, Bach takes this job at Leipzig in 1723. Remember, he's 3rd on the list. They want 2 other guys. They want Telemann and Graupner, but they can't get them. So there is a wonderful, famous memo that says, I think we're going to have to settle for Bach, which is what I think it should be the name of this festival. Right. Yeah, but somebody actually wrote that, and they took Bach. They knew he could play the organ like nobody's business, but he was not a published composer like they wanted. He didn't really publish much, but they took him for this job at Leipzig, and when Bach arrived at Leipzig in 1723, he went all in with writing cantata cycles. This is something he'd probably been planning for some time, and that is to write a cantata for every week of the church year. And sometimes it would be more than one a week, depending on how many festivals there were that day. Sometimes he borrowed from earlier pieces that he'd written, but most of the time he was reinventing himself week in and week out. Nobody knows how he did this. On top of that load, he was writing the St. John Passion. This is in the early years at Leipzig. And he wrote a St. Mark Passion, which is lost. It's completely lost. We really don't know anything about it. We have the St. John. And then he wrote the St. Matthew Passion, which we're talking about today. He probably got it up and running good enough in April of 1727 for an opening performance of it, minus a few interesting pieces that we are now going to present, in the version that we're doing now. It was performed on Good Friday at the Vespers service on Good Friday. A lot of times Bach, whatever music he was presenting, he presented twice. Once at the Nikolai Church in Leipzig, and the other time at the St. Thomas Church, sometimes twice in the same day. There is a chance that he did the St. Matthew Passion twice in one day, running back and forth between the churches. But he certainly did this on usual Sundays. Just, we always think we're busy, but that's really busy. Okay, so anyway, that was at Good Friday service. The idea of the Passion is to give a kind of almost a semi-operatic interpretation, without going all the way to opera, right, of the events of Good Friday. That's Jesus's betrayal, his willingness to go to Jerusalem, his betrayal and his trial and crucifixion. And it ends with the death on the cross and the burial, and what is sometimes called an incomplete arch form, and that it all goes to this ending, right, that is not going to be satisfied or answered until Easter 3 days later. So, and that was the idea, was to present this in as dramatic a fashion as possible without quite crossing over into opera. The reason I keep mentioning opera is because opera was on the rise. People, even in Leipzig, devout people in Leipzig were going to operas. They knew what operas were. And this is Bach's way of kind of reconciling church music and opera. And we'll talk about how he structures it. So it's written for all sorts of dialectic forces. It's very interesting, the construction of this piece, because there are two choirs, there are two orchestras. There's the evangelist, who's a tenor, who's telling you the story. There's Jesus, is actually a dedicated singer right there, singing Jesus's dialogue like that. And then there are all sorts of other minor characters, Pontius Pilate, Judas, Peter. They all make appearances. On top of this, you have the chorale, which is like the soul of the congregation, pouring out its feelings about what events that are happening as it goes on. You have personal prayers, which are very sophisticated arias and recitatives, which are really kind of like an interior thinking process of summarizing what has happened so far in the drama. You also have dramatic choruses where the crowd is at one point screaming for Jesus' blood. That's interrupted by a very beautiful, quiet aria saying why Jesus is dying. And then the crowd comes pouring back in, the mob saying at an even higher key, up a step, saying, crucify him, like that. And Bach is, I think the whole work is really dedicated to kind of a dialectic, dramatic quality that he wants to play out. So that's why you have these opposing forces and also large-scale and small-scale pieces. So within it. So I want to walk through some of the great movie technique that Bach uses in this. This is the ultimate cinemascope art film of its day. And I think you can see as we just kind of walk through its structure why Bach valued it so much. He starts with two choirs and two orchestras in dialogue with each other in a very serious, heavy E minor with this kind of a throbbing, a heartbeat, an undertow to the whole thing. Boom, 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 like that. And one choir is singing these rising arpeggios, calling out to the other choir. The first choir are the believers who kind of know this is an important story. The second choir are the daughters of Zion who are kind of just waking up to the idea of it. And you have one choir trying to get the attention of the other choir. So it's already loaded with this dialectic drama right out of the gate. The first choir is saying, come and see Jesus. The bridegroom, remember Jesus is always the bridegroom of the church, right? But also Jesus the Lamb of God who is going to be sacrificed. About the second time they say that, suddenly a boys' choir, a children's choir, emerges from one of the high swallow's nest up in the St. Thomas Church, right? And we'll have a boys' choir singing this too. And they're singing a very slow-moving, arching chorale, O Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. So it's about as complex crane shot in a movie that you could ever have. And this is his opening salvo in this. So all three of these things are spinning around. The invocation from one choir, the second choir saying what, where, who are you talking about? And then the boy choir saying it's the Lamb of God that is to come. So, and mixed metaphors and all. Jesus is bridegroom, Jesus is lamb. There's all of this happening. When that finally closes on this amazingly surprising E major chord, which comes out of nowhere, after all this E minor and G major stuff, the field of focus shoots down into an incredibly narrow thing, and you have the evangelist tenor and just a couple of instruments accompanying him, and he's in a speaking style. It's sung, but it's spoken, operatic recitative. The first thing the tenor, the evangelist, Matthew, says is, and when Jesus had finished his sermon. That's the first thing you hear is, when he had finished this sermon. And of course, our question is, what sermon? You know, so it's tried and true theater. Shakespeare does it all the time. The first thing you hear is the tail end of something that you wish you'd heard, like that, right? And it's still used in movies all the time. And Bach is plugging into it. So when Jesus had finished whatever it was he was talking about, he says to the disciples, I know you've forgotten this, but in 2 days it's Passover, and I need to go to Jerusalem to be crucified. And it's just, they just come apart. They really had thought everything was going great with their ministry. They were spreading this word of love and forgiveness. And now the leader says, yeah, it's in the scriptures. It's time to go. Right. So And this sets up another dialectic. Jesus is working on a kind of a scriptural fulfillment agenda, which is that this has already been written down. It has to happen, and I'm playing it out, and it's going to hurt, but I'm going to play it out. And the disciples having a visceral response to it, saying, isn't there some way we can get around this, and not do it? So that happens. Then the next thing that happens is the congregation, you're out of the story. Notice how Bach plunges you into a story, and then suddenly you're in the present tense, and the congregation in a huge chorale says, "Dear Jesus, what have you done to deserve such a fate?" With a very famous chorale called Herzliebster, Dearest Jesus. So Bach is really playing a couple of different time frames and a different psychological frames between the story that's going on and the oversoul of the congregation that's happening, and various levels in between. This is about the first 7 minutes of the piece, right? Of a 2.5-hour piece, right? I'm just trying to get you into what an amazing movie it is. When that ends, we go back into the story, and there's Matthew, the evangelist, talking to us again. And Matthew says, meanwhile, it's the ultimate meanwhile moment. He says, meanwhile, the Pharisees and the scribes and the elders are plotting how to kill Jesus. And so you go back into the story, but you're off on a sidebar type of a thing. Within that, you have another split-off division, as you had when Jesus announced to his disciples, it's time to go to Jerusalem. You have a split-off within the scribes and Pharisees, and they say, oh, well, yes, we should kill him, for sure, but don't do it on Passover. It's really bad press to do something like this. So there's all sorts of they didn't have, CNN and all of that stuff, but it's still the same. But, everyone is kind of trying to cover themselves at the same time. So they say, don't do this on the Passover. And then that's taken into account. The next scene you shift back to Jesus. And Jesus is on his way to Bethany, and he's with his disciples, and they stop at the house of Simon the leper. So you're in this movie. You can kind of see them moving, even though nobody's moving around on the stage. You're told that they're ambulating. They stop for dinner. And at Simon's house, a woman takes a very expensive bottle of ointment and rubs it onto Jesus' head as a way of showing her love for him and affection. The disciples see this, and we have another split off at this point, just like with the Pharisees. We have another kind of micromanaging moment here. The disciples say, wait a minute, you could feed a village with the amount of money that bottle of ointment cost, right? And they're absolutely right. And Jesus says, she's getting me ready to be buried, and you're going to always have the poor. They'll always be with you, but I'm only going to be with you for a couple more days. And more importantly, what she has done from love, right? And wherever this gospel is preached, she will be remembered because of it. And it's a parable within a parable at this point, because he's telling them what is done truly from love is always what counts in the end. And he doesn't say as much, but his giving his life for everybody is kind of what the woman has done here. She has given, she has kind of done, taken her own initiative to make this happen. It's a great moment. I think Bach is kind of trying to tell you what the piece is really all about. In the end, it is about forgiveness and generosity. And that's why the Matthew is so powerful. In 2 hours beyond that, it will all come to this one aria in which the kind of the soul, the base soul of the congregation says, if I can only absorb this message deep within my heart, right, then I will understand. One other level I just want to say before we just talk about a few more details is that, Bach, of course, is a devout Christian. He believes very much in this story. And at one level, you can abstract it and say, yes, it's about forgiveness. We should all be forgiving and get beyond things. Forgive 7 times 70 and all of that. But I think Bach, as a Christian, He understood that you have to understand it in the abstract, but you also have to understand it in a real, visceral time. That is, Jesus, in Bach's mind, Jesus did this. It was a physical act. It's not just be good to each other. It actually involves somebody's physical suffering. So it's kind of it's both of those things working together that makes this so powerful. It's the concept and the faith of it, and also that it was something that actually happened in Bach's theology. So, any questions so far? I mean, it's a big piece, but if we're going to roll it into a ball, I think that's important. I want to finish out the first half. After Jesus is he's with the disciples, the next thing he springs on them is that one of you is going to betray me. And this is another, they have this tight group. They're all believers. And Jesus says, now it's one of you is going to turn me in. And then they all say, is it I? Is it I? Is it I? Is it I? Each disciple, I think there's 12 iterations of, is it I? And then the congregation pulls you out of that scene, and there's this huge explosion of a chorale that says, I am the one who should be sorry. Like that. So you're no longer among the disciples, but it's back on you. Bach is always, I guess you could say he's shattering what they call the fourth wall in theater, right? There is really no barrier here. Everything flows out to the congregation and back. And so the congregation says, it is I who should be sorry. It is I who have betrayed you. And it is my sins that have caused this all to be necessary to happen like that. So it's a very dramatic moment. He brings the chorale in the key of A flat, which is one of the wildest keys in the 18th century tuning systems. And it's got huge wings and kind of fractiousness to it like that. So that's an important moment. Then they go up to the Mount of Olives, and it's important up there. This is where Jesus kind of takes on the sin of the world and it goes to pray, and he asks God, is it really necessary for this to happen? And not my will, but your will. And Jesus leaves his disciples, and he says, please keep guard, because I know they're coming tonight to get me. So can you just stay awake? And it's a little bit funny at this point. Could you just stay awake? And he goes to pray and doesn't get an answer, and he comes back. They're all just completely passed out. It's 2 a.m, and they're exhausted. And he says, can't you stay awake for an hour? Come on, you can't. I'm going to go pray again. I'll be back, And he goes and prays again, and this time he rephrases it. It's very important, and when we do this, you'll be able to read all the text in English up above the group. They'll be singing in German, but you can read it in English. And Jesus says at this point, I think I understand that this cup, this metaphorical cup, will not pass from me unless I drink it, right? So again, it's physical. You've got to drink it, even though it's a metaphor, right? And then he goes back and he finds the disciples sleeping again, and he says, he just doesn't even bother with them, right? And he goes away again, and then he comes back a few minutes later, and he's very upset because he can kind of sense that Judas and the soldiers are coming like that. And it's the only point where in the Passion where Jesus kind of loses his temper, and he on this huge diminished chord, he shrieks, "Get up!" Like that to the disciples. He said, "Wake up!" He says, "They're coming," and he kind of is entertaining the idea of maybe we should run, But it's way too late. And then Judas shows up and kisses Jesus to identify him to the soldiers, and then he's taken. The first half of the St. Matthew Passion ends with Jesus in zip ties. we do, right? And he's been bound, and you return to the opening key of E minor, which is where it all began in the first chorus. And in the 18th century tuning system, you can actually kind of tell what key you're in. Every key has its own color. And you'll hear him return to that home key. And it's a beautiful duet where the soprano and the alto are singing this figure that has, you can almost feel the impingement on it like that. And the struggle to get out of these bonds. And the text is, Jesus is now imprisoned or, is captive like that. And it builds and builds and builds to an amazing high point between the two singers like that. And then the choirs both come in exploding with thunder and lightning. And this is Bach, again, touching on opera. And he took quite a bit of blowback in his church for there are memos where people are saying, don't you think you went a little too far? It's like, if we want that kind of stuff, we'll go to the opera, right? But he did it, and the text is that we'll have lightning and thunder disappeared into the mist at this point, meaning, is there no power on earth that can free Jesus and get him out of this thing? And it's a wonderfully dramatic chorus with it boom, 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 like that. So you can really hear the thunder and lightning. And when that ends, there's almost the energy is carried over, and you have Jesus and all his disciples and the soldiers, and one of Jesus' disciples draws his sword. Matthew tells us his sword is drawn, and he cuts the ear off of one of the soldiers, like that. So it's in the heat of the moment, like that. And then, in the beautiful fashion that you always find in the St. Matthew, Jesus interrupts and says, "Put your sword away." And the famous line, "He who lives by the sword shall die by it," like that. And it cools it all down, okay? Up to this, the last thing that happens at the end of the first big act is that the disciples have already been told by Jesus that when things get bad, as they have already, the flock will be scattered, like that. And they've all said, there's no way that we're going to be scattered. We're staying with the program. At this moment, they all kind of look at each other after the sword is put away. And Jesus has said the scriptures are being fulfilled, and the disciples all take off in 12 different directions, basically. It's a great moment. And the last piece of this first half is you can hear their footsteps, like that. It's kind of running, a fleeing motion, and the boy choir comes back in with a slow chorale. On top of that, the sins of humanity, bewail your great sin. One of the things that Bach does so well is that he has different amounts of time working together. You can hear this in the various choruses between great activity in one part and super slow long notes in other parts. So remember, in the Baroque conception of the universe, it's a huge clockwork like that. You have little wheels and big wheels all engaged with each other, all turning at different rates, right, making it add up. But it's a fascinating way to let musical art evolve. And so great detail and huge gesture all working at the same time. So anyway, that's as much as I can do for the first half. The second half is about Peter's denial of Jesus. It's about the trial. It's the bloodthirsty crowd, the freeing of Barabbas, and then the crucifixion itself, and ultimately assimilation of the story into the soul. So Bach, in the St. Matthew, he uses several chorales, and Bach's parishioners, in the St. Thomas Church would have known these chorales, and some of them were very famous songs. A lot of them were even pop songs before they became chorales. They were wonderful love songs. And I'm going to play you a few of them in their love song form, and then show you how they became Lutheran chorales, and then how they end up in the Passion. And I thought we would just probably start with the Passion Chorale. You'll know this one. It's sometimes called the Passion Chorale. And it comes from an old song written, a century or so before by Hostler. And the original text was, "My mind is all twisted up. This young girl has just freaked me out." That is really the translation. And this becomes the Passion Chorale. You'll know the tune. Here's the way that it would have been rhythmicized back when it was a love song 100 years before Bach. my mind is all destroyed by this beautiful young woman. Okay, Bach takes the same tune, because no good tune should go to waste, that's what they say, and he uses it right after Jesus has told the disciples the flock will be dispersed, and you will be scattered in the difficulty of the times coming. And the congregation and the soul of the disciples basically responds, "Protect me, O Lord, my shepherd." That's in the key of E major. It's a very bright, sunny key. The disciples are probably still pushing against Jesus, thinking that they can overcome the difficulty that is about to ensue. Jesus goes on and has to deal with them and deal with Peter. Peter steps up and says, "Lord, no matter how difficult it gets, I'm with you. Even if I have to be murdered with you, I'll stay with you." And Jesus says, 3 times before the cock crows tomorrow morning, you're going to deny me. You can't see it coming, but you will deny me. And after that exchange happens, the same chorale, the exact same chorale, returns a half step lower in the key of E flat. And I think you can feel the kind of deflation that's happened among the disciples at this point. They're worried, And here it is in E flat, half step lower. Much later on, I'll just do a couple more of these. The same tune appears. The Passion Chorale appears 5 times, sprinkled among other chorales. Next, we're going to hear it down another half step in the key of D major, which is a very sweet key in the tuning, in the Baroque tuning system. And at this point, Jesus is on trial with Pontius Pilate, and Jesus has said nothing in response to great accusations of blasphemy against him, saying to Jesus, "You blasphemed God." And Pilate says, "Don't you hear what they're saying?" And Jesus responds with nothing. And this iteration of the chorale is about patience and trust in God, the God who guides the clouds and the wind will also take care of you. So here it is in D major. I just give you a sample of the last 2 iterations. This is the one in which the words which Bach's parishioners would have known appear. This is during the scourging of Jesus, and this is O Sacred Head, now wounded. It's the highest and kind of tightest version of the chorale, and just here's the color of it. Some stops to make it even brighter and toothier and nastier sounding, but it's also part of this way it's set in a high key. The last iteration of the Passion Chorale, and I'll close with this today, is in A minor, and Jesus has just died, and instead of a meditation on the action at hand, you have the soul of the congregation reflecting on what will my life add up to when it is time to depart. And we'll use a very quiet stop, and this is in the key of A minor. Again, Bach kind of crossing that line into the audience. Psychologically, the effect is that it puts the question back to you. It's in your lap how you want to conduct yourself and lead your life. So anyway, that's just 5 iterations of the chorale. There are many other chorales and many other dramatic scenes in the St. Matthew. I hope so much you can come hear this production. It's taken us a year and a half to get this together. Musicians from all over the United States are coming for this. People who specialize in performing this work, all on period instrument. These cards at the back, 2 weeks from tonight. It's coming. Thanks so much. I know we have other schedule to continue on, so I'm going to move along and let it go. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Trevor.
Probably not. I hope you can sit here when I was saying.
Yes.